Thank you. I am Kim Fish, the housing coordinator. We have Jed Cornett, the town planner. Alexis Lanzalata. I tried to get it. Thank you. I'm sorry. She's with Barrett Planning Group. And she has Tony's here somewhere. There's Tony back there. And Jeff Davis with Horsley and Witten. And we also have Melinda here, the assistant town planner. I just wanted to take a second and thank the school department for allowing us the use of the high school tonight. And thank the DPW director for this microphone that we have to talk really close into. And also, thanks FCTV for being here tonight. But what I really wanted to do is just take 1 second to thank you all for coming out in this cold, dark night. We know that housing is a massive crisis, and we're not going to be able to put a dent in it unless our community gets together and do something, and y'all showed up. And that is so important to us, so we really appreciate it. We cannot do this without you. So I just want to take a second and give you all a round of applause. Thank you so much. Thank you. So I think, Alexis, are you going to take it, or Jeff?
I'm going to kick us off.
Okay. Jeff is going to start the presentation, and then Alexis will be after him. So thanks a lot, everyone.
All right, good evening, everyone. I'm going to try to keep my section as brief as possible because we have a lot of information to share with you tonight. And as with the meeting in November, our goal is to spend as much time hearing from you tonight. As you can see, we have stations throughout the room, and my colleague Alexis is going to talk a bit more about how that's going to work. We do hope that the majority of this evening will be open house style, where you can look at the boards and review some of the strategies that the team and town staff have started to develop based on the feedback that you've heard from the community so far. But first, this works, great. A little bit of introduction. So we've all been introduced, so I will move along to the next slide. And again, we're going to have a brief presentation followed by an open house. You're welcome to stay as long or as little as you'd like until you feel you've given your feedback. All this information will be up on the town's website as well. So tell your friends and neighbors who are not here tonight. All right, I just wanted to start with, well, actually, first a show of hands. How many of you were here at the November meeting? So I get a sense. Yeah, I see a lot of familiar faces, but some new faces as well. So we do want to take a moment to tell you a little bit about what a housing production plan is and why the town is doing one. So the purpose of the housing production plan is to facilitate the development and preservation of homes that meet the requirements of the state's affordable housing law. As you may know, the state requires municipalities to hit at least 10% of their year-round housing units as affordable. And as of this fall, Falmouth was at 8.11%, which is actually really good. You've been making a ton of progress as a community. So this is something that every 5 years is adopted by the planning board and the select board before it's submitted to what is now called the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities. You may have been more familiar with it as TXCD. They recently changed their name. So what are the components of a housing production plan, or HPP? We start with a needs assessment. So that's looking at the demographics of the community, an inventory of the existing housing throughout the town, a projection of the housing needs that are likely based on your population and population trends, development constraints. We recognize that there are a lot of constraints to development on the land that does remain in this community. We want to be sensitive to that. And also making sure that you have the infrastructure capacity to support the housing you need. Next, we look at housing goals. So what types of housing does the community need? And how feasible is it to build those? And how consistent is it with the needs that we've identified? We also have to create a numerical housing production goal to show how the town is going to work to hit its 10% goal. Finally, we end with an implementation strategy. How are you going to meet the housing goals that you've identified? So this includes all the things that we're talking about tonight, the actual strategies, zoning and policy changes, identification of specific sites that might be appropriate for housing development, the desired characteristics of development, what should it look like, how should it function, who should it serve, and regional partnerships, ways that you can work with other towns and across the Cape and the region to achieve these goals. So when we say affordable, what does that mean? So we are primarily looking at homes that are eligible for the state's SHI eligibility list. So official affordable housing per the state law. And there are income limits for this. And I'm not going to get into great detail, but based on the incomes in Barnstable County, there are certain targets that are defined as being affordable for people making a certain amount of the area median income. And this is something that is set by HUD. So, whose housing needs will this plan address? And I want to be clear that while the primary purpose of an HPP is to hit your 10% affordable housing, this plan can be used for housing needs more broadly. In fact, I'm working with the town of Barnstable right now on their local comprehensive plan, and they have designed their HPP to address all of their housing needs, and it's basically serving as the housing chapter of their local comprehensive plan. So communities can go from a very strict, solitary look at meeting their 10%, all the way to a full look at your housing needs as a community. And Falmouth will likely fall somewhere in between. Finally, we discussed where future housing will go. And that's where the strategies that we're talking tonight come into play. The zoning that allows different types of housing, and also identification of particular sites that you might want to encourage for 40B development. So with that, that's my quick little introduction. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Alexis to talk a bit about what we've heard from the public so far that got us to what you see on the boards today, and a bit more information on data.
Okay, thank you everybody for being here. This is a really great turnout once again. I'm so glad to see this many people who've joined us this evening. So as Jeff pointed out, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we heard at the first community meeting. We do have a summary of that if it's not on the project page yet, it'll be very soon. In case you did not get to attend that meeting, you can take a look and see what we kind of gleaned from it. And so that will be available along with the recording, which is already there. But so some of the things that we heard, in general, a much greater need for a greater variety of year-round housing types. So we heard from the various groups that were at the last community meeting that the current housing market, there's a general recognition that it's not in line with the wages of many who work in the community or who want to come live in the community. And that the limited housing stock really affects residents of all ages and incomes in kind of different ways. There was definitely a recognition that there's a lack of housing options, primarily price-wise, to meet the needs of younger generations, but also in terms of the stock for younger professionals who maybe need a one-bedroom, just kind of a lack of stock for meeting that need. And we heard quite a bit about how that kind of missing middle housing, which generally is defined as the types of housing that fall somewhere between single-family homes and larger multifamily. So it's things like your duplex, your three-family home, townhouses, smaller multifamily, and so those kind of missing middle. Cottage clusters is another common type. So they're things that your zoning currently doesn't really readily allow or facilitate, and so one of our goals is to figure out what of those missing middle housing types will be, best meet community needs, and what the town's regulations can do to address that. So we also heard a definite need for rental housing. One of the questions in the last community meeting focused on, in the last housing production plan, there was a clear goal for focusing on rental housing. And so one of the questions was, do you still agree with this split? And there were some kind of mixed responses, but in general, there was a lot of consensus that multifamily homes and rental units, it can help sustain a healthy housing market, alleviating some of the intense competition for the limited rentals that are available. And it kind of provides a transitional opportunity for people who want to move to the community but maybe aren't ready to buy yet. There's kind of a clear recognition that it's easier to produce units in larger numbers than single-family homes and ownership units. However, on the flip side, there was also a lot of recognition that there's some concern about the scale of development and kind of the suitability for the town. What we heard about ownership opportunities, there was also identified need for ownership opportunities. So as an example, we heard about the need for smaller single-family homes. I'll be talking about some of your single-family home trends a little bit later and how, I'm sure no surprise to you, the newer homes tend to be larger, a lot more costly. And so, where are those smaller home opportunities for younger households interested in home ownership? And we also heard that, well, yes, it is nice to have opportunities for people who maybe aren't ready to buy, a sense that having ownership opportunities kind of gives a greater sense of permanence for people moving to the community, and it allows households to establish roots in the community and build wealth. In terms of locations, you will have an opportunity to weigh in on that more this evening, but some locations that we heard include, but not limited to, Woods Hole, various town-owned properties, underutilized public school buildings, or the areas around elementary schools. We also heard that ADUs and other housing types that are kind of well integrated into the existing fabric of the community are more likely to be well received. And we also heard a bit about how modifying zoning, in particular to expand the mixed residential commercial overlay district, can help support some kind of denser housing in areas near the center and away from the more natural areas of town. So on that note, what we heard about the environment, no surprise, that is a very big and legitimate concern when it comes to housing development in your community and on Cape Cod in general. So there were concerns about developing and encroaching into the town's natural resources, open green spaces, and a lot of concern, of course, about water quality. So some of the suggestions that people had in relation to that were to really focus on redevelopment of existing buildings, converting into housing, protecting green spaces and maintaining a sense of comfort outdoors. And then there was emphasis in a couple of the groups about the need to really fix existing septic systems that aren't on sewer, but also to improve stormwater infrastructure to really protect that water quality. And then the last thing that we heard that we'll also be talking about in the data tonight, the factors relating to the seasonality of the community. So we heard, that, well, is there really actually a need for more housing, or is it just being, kind of misused in some way? So some participants expressed, concern about the number of second homes and short-term rentals, and some suggestions to implement regulations to limit those short-term rentals to promote year-round housing. And yet, I thought this was interesting, not that it's necessarily an apples-to-apples kind of comparison between ADUs and short-term rentals, but there was also some expression that the ADU bylaw was too restrictive, and people wanted to see it relaxed a little bit to encourage the construction of ADUs. So we certainly heard more, and again, I welcome you to review that meeting summary that will be online. But I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the data. Some of this is a repeat from the first meeting, but I really tried to really just focus on newer information, really only pulling from the first meeting where it kind of fills into the broader conversation. So I really wanted to focus primarily on the housing itself in this presentation. In the last meeting, we focused a lot more on demographics, and we do touch upon that a little bit tonight as well. But one of the big trends that is no surprise, I'm sure, is just the shift in the population age. And I know that is, that's not unique to Falmouth, and it's not unique to many communities on Cape Cod. But if you can take a look at over here, the population under 18, the percentage of your population under 18 over the past 30 years has shrunk quite a bit in Falmouth. Even more so than Barnstable County as a whole, and of course much more significantly in Massachusetts or United States. And then conversely, the population over 65 has grown more significantly than the county as a whole. So we also talked at the last meeting about different household types, looking at your community, the county, and the state. And so there's a fairly even kind of split between those what are called family households, and non-family households. And non-family households include people who are living alone, but also those who are not living alone, such as people in kind of a roommate situation, so unrelated households. And so there's a 60-40 split approximately in your community. And so that's fairly in line with the county and the state. I did want to point out that your population living alone in Falmouth and in Barnstable County is higher than Massachusetts. And in particular, that 65+% living alone is higher in both the county and in Falmouth as compared to the state. Again, not too surprising given the prevalence of retirees in the community. So in terms of kind of population historic trends here, so this is looking at each census up through 2020, so from 1930 to 2020, and then after where it starts to tip down with these dotted lines, those are actually population projections developed in 2022 by University of Massachusetts Amherst, the Donahue Institute, which is an institute for population research. And so, you can take them with a grain of salt, of course, but they were, I was glad to see that they were developed post-COVID. Some other population projections that were developed before COVID, it's a little harder to really know how much those still stand. But so you can see, so Falmouth is the orange line with the bigger circles. And so like most communities on Cape Cod, there actually was a jump from 2010 to 2020, even though originally it was anticipated that there would be a continued drop. But even despite that jump, there's still prediction that the population will continue to decline, and the percentage, I didn't include this on this graph, but it will continue to shift older. So I wanted to show where like the biggest kind of increase in slope is from 1970 to 2000, which coincides with your housing unit growth, which I'm going to skip ahead here actually, and look at the age of housing stock. So you can see in your, in Falmouth and the surrounding Upper Cape communities that there's a lot of housing in particular built between 1960 and 2000. So that's these, these kind of, these middle segments here that I put the numbers in bold, compared to Massachusetts. Massachusetts, the state as a whole, has a lot more older homes than on Cape Cod, and that really aligns with when those population booms on Cape Cod really took place. In terms of the housing stock, so again, we're looking at kind of the Upper Cape communities and seeing, a prevalence of single-family detached homes. The single-family attached, that usually refers to things like condominiums or townhomes where there's an entrance at grade for each unit. So you can see actually in Falmouth, Bourne, Mashpee, Sandwich, Upper Cape in general, actually with the exception of Sandwich, there's kind of a prevalence of those townhouse structures. So I just wanted to highlight the second most prevalent for each as well to show that, again, in these Upper Cape communities, behind the single-family detached are the single-family attached. There's not a lot of units in the multifamily properties. So that is based on American Community Survey data, which are really estimates. What we have here is actually based on your assessor's records. And so one thing that I want to caution you about, these numbers correspond to properties and not units, and I'll explain why that's important in a minute. So for your single-family detached, and this is, as current as the assessor's records that we have are, it doesn't mean if there's a home, that broke ground yesterday that it's going to be accounted for here. But just over 18,600 single-family detached homes and about 1,400 condominiums in your community. And then, it kind of decreases as we get to the other types of household types. But again, these are properties, not units. And I think that's really important to point out because, just as an example to remember, if you have 305 two-family properties, that's 610 units there. There are approximately 63 properties that have apartments, either from 4 units on up to a whole bunch of units, and together, based on assessor's records, those provide over 675 units, and that's not even counting housing authority apartments. Speaking of the housing authority, there are 30 housing authority properties that together are providing over 300 units. So it's important to think about, are we talking about units or are we talking about the actual properties? We also, in looking at your most prevalent housing type, which is obviously those single-family detached, it's really important for us to get an understanding of what that looks like in your community because that's the bulk of your housing stock. So I know this is a whole lot of numbers, so I'm going to break it down for you. But essentially, we broke down by 20-year periods, grouping everything built prior to 1900 together. And you can see, the number of entries in your assessor's records for those older homes, not very many. And again, that kind of big boom between 1960 and 2000, those numbers there. But I'm going to break it down a little bit to focus on those homes built prior to 1960. Some of the things that I think it's interesting to see is, so the average number of stories is shrinking, starting with some of those older, larger homes. The average number of rooms also shrinking. Lot size shrinking. So the older homes that may have been larger, built on larger lot sizes, the average building size shrinking, assessed value shrinking. This improvement value to land value ratio, I talked a little bit about it at the last meeting, but just quick recap. Essentially, if that ratio is under 1, it means the land holds more value than the building. If the ratio is over 1, it means the building has more value. So now looking at the newer housing stock, so 1960 onward, again, that's when a lot of your single-family housing stock was built. You can see now it's trending back up in terms of the size. So average stories going back up, average number of rooms going back up. Lot sizes, kind of up, down, and I think for some of the newer homes, a lot of it has to do with kind of more cluster subdivisions and things like that. Because you certainly can't have, that lot size in many of your zoning districts. But the residential area is, again, trending up, and assessed values way trending up. So you can see some of those implications that really resonate with what people are talking about when they say, people can't afford to move to our community. So I'm keeping an eye on the time here. I promised we'd be done with the presentation at 7:05, and I'm determined to stick to that. So with those improvement to land value ratios, the kind of darker colors indicate, again, that the buildings are holding more value than the land. So if you look, the green colors, it's really not surprising. You're seeing a lot of along the water. And if you look over there at the, there's also an age of housing stock map. A lot of the colors really match up. So those older homes that might, especially if they're along the water and they haven't been torn down, it's definitely the greater value in the land, which puts them at risk of tear down. So yeah, you can see here, I just wanted to kind of zero in on some inland waters and coastal waters. You can really see the green along right along the water, which brings me to a topic that came up at the last meeting quite a bit, which was short-term rentals. Now, that doesn't fully, connect to those coastal areas, but I didn't map this for purposes of the presentation, but a lot of your STRs are along the water. And so we looked at the number of registered short-term rentals in each of the upper Cape communities. And so Falmouth, as of today, you can check this any day, the state has a registry of registered short-term rentals. So just over 1,400 in Falmouth. And so you can see the number's a lot higher than other Upper Cape communities, but you also have more housing units. So what we wanted to look at was the percent of those short-term rentals as in kind of relationship to your housing units. And so it's not really that far off from Mashpee or Sandwich. And I also just want to point out, because we did hear a lot that there's this loss of year-round rentals because people want to instead, the short-term rental model is more lucrative. And so I do just want to keep in mind it's not, we can't easily say all of these could necessarily be a unit on their own if they were to be, they can't necessarily be a year-round rental because it could be a bedroom. You can have just a bedroom on Airbnb or whatever. So these are just all STRs together. So we talked at the last meeting about the sharply rising costs of purchasing a single-family home in Falmouth, but really everywhere, as we know. And so what we have here are the median single-family sales price from 1987 to 2023, adjusted for inflation. And then we also have the number of sales, which are going down. Now, typically when the number of sales goes down, you expect the prices to drop, and that's not happening. In fact, this graph is already outdated because your median single-family sales price went up another, 50,000 or so from when I first made this graph to when November was included in the figure. So we want to look at an affordability gap to kind of get a sense of, well, what can people actually afford if they're earning that area median income that my colleague Jeff mentioned. And so the area median income for all households in Barnstable County is about $124,000. Now, if you factor in, so this is factoring in your residential property tax rate, average weekly mortgage rates as of this week, and other standard factors like property insurance and whatnot. So this is not accounting for every family's individual household budgets, but in general, a household with that income could afford around a $400,000 purchase price, but your median single-family sales price is at $700,000. So that's an affordability gap of about $300,000, which is obviously very significant. And your income required to be able to afford that is much higher than your median income. We also wanted to look at the rental gap, and so this is a little trickier to capture because there's such limited data available. So I did the best I could here, but essentially, so the estimated median household income for Falmouth renter households is about $34,500. And so if you take 30% of that, divided by 12, so that someone is not what's called cost burden, which means they're paying more than 30% of their income towards housing, they could afford housing costs of $860 a month. So so I'm just trying to be generous here and say for a one-bedroom, the utility allowance that we went with was $130, and that's based on Falmouth Housing Authority. They have to publish utility allowance figures to help calculate rent for purposes of like housing choice vouchers and whatnot. And so just, kind of loosely coming up with a housing utility allowance, that would leave you with the ability to pay $733 a month in rent if you were earning that median renter income. And if you look at, the fair market rent for Barnstable County, or we did a rent survey, very limited ability, only a sample size of 11 were we able to base this on, but that median rent was about $1,500. So a huge affordability gap for renters as well. So that brings us to the subsidized housing inventory, which is, one of the great ways you can make housing affordable. But there are caveats with that, of course. So of your year-round housing units, which is significantly less than your total housing units, which you recall was around 20,000. So just under 16,000 year-round housing units, you currently have 1,289 on that state subsidized housing inventory. So the gap that you currently have to achieve 10% is 301 units. Now, that is not touching the actual level of need in terms of households who are lower moderate income in your community, but at least, your community is doing really well compared to a lot of other communities in terms of closing that gap on 10%. So the housing production plan is required to have a stated annual production goal that's just based on a very straightforward formula of 0.5% of your year-round housing units. So for Falmouth, that's 80 units a year for this current housing production plan, and if you were to make that, you would achieve 10% during this housing production plan. So that's good to know. However, as I mentioned, there's a sizable gap there. So there's an estimated 3,900 low to moderate income households in your community that are cost burdened, which means they're paying more than 30% of their income towards housing costs. 3,900 is a lot more than 1,289. Now, if you want to narrow it down more, there's 1,800, again, these are estimates, severely cost-burdened, low to moderate income households in your community, still higher than the number of SHI units in your community, and even if that gap was close to the 10%, it's still not meeting that actual need. So that gap is not unique to Falmouth. I want to stress that. That's not criticism. In fact, I've never seen a community where the 10% goal actually reflects the number of low to moderate income households. But I think it is important to recognize that even if you do achieve that 10%, your community still has kind of decisions to make about the commitment to affordable housing and meeting identified needs in your community. So I know that was an awful lot. These slides will be online, and when the draft of the housing production plan is available, you'll get to dive more deeply into the data. But I think really, in a nutshell, there's a clear need for housing of a wide variety in your community. But we want to hear from you. And so we have 5 open house stations. Now, if my counting was correct, I counted around 40, and then I saw more people trickle in. So sorry? Oh, that is awesome. Now, that also means each station might get a little crowded, so, take your time. Maybe you want to have some cookies, chat with your friends, but, I'm going to walk you through each of the stations very quickly, and you can just go wherever interests you. So the stations that we have, and I wanted to put this up again to point out that tonight we're looking for your input on strategies, which includes location of housing, also regulatory strategies, financing strategies, and a whole bunch of other ways to meet those housing needs. But so there are 5 stations. My order on this list does not match the room, so I apologize for that. But just to kind of walk you through, there is the most obvious one is the mapping future housing development site station over there. And so, Jed, you want to give a wave? Jed will be over at that station, and we'll walk you through the instructions for that. And then there's also capacity building strategies, which is over here. Tony will be at that station. Tony, can you give a wave? And yeah, you can make your way on over there. And that's really just ways to increase the town's capacity to address housing needs. Affordable housing strategies is over there with Kim. And that is really her wheelhouse there as the housing coordinator, so she'll have a lot of expertise there to answer your questions on those strategies. Regulatory strategies is over here with Jeff, so a lot of that is zoning. It's not just zoning, I think, but a lot of the strategies do relate to zoning and just other kind of regulations that the town can look into to address housing needs. And then finance and subsidy strategies is over there, and that is where I will be. So you can really, again, just go to the stations that interest you. You don't have to go in any order. If it looks like there's a crowd, visit somewhere else or have a snack. Or you also have at your stations the participant feedback sheet, so you can take a minute and fill that out if you want to wait for some room to free up at a station. So are there any questions about the stations? Okay, so there's a whole lot of dot stickers at each station, sticky notes, things like that. So we're really looking for your input, and can't wait to chat with you. So you can go for it.
Okay, so this has been something that the county that have very specific Somerville, for example. I was just reviewing their zoning. They have very specific design standards.
Drafting of the plan, wherever possible, we give examples of what other communities have done. So we would certainly do our homework on that, be able to give some examples.
Double if
Oh, cheating.
That's okay.